Hello, my name is Talos. I'm going to be starting a brand new series called Books and Blankets, where I make a blanket inspired by a book, and each new one will be a kind of sample in a way, reading the first chapter of each book while making a blanket. So, this is going to be the first book, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. Hopefully I pronounced that correct. And we're going to be starting in chapter 1. A squat gray building of only 34 stories. Over the main entrance, the words Central London Hatchery and Conditioning Center, and in a shield, the World State's motto, Community, Identity, Stability. The enormous room on the ground floor faced towards the north, cold for all the summer beyond the panes. For all the tropical heat of the room itself, a harsh thin light glared through the windows, hungrily seeking some draped lay figure, some plaid shape of academic goose flesh, but finding only glass and a nickel and bleakly shining porcelain of a laboratory. Winteries responded to winteries. The overall of the workers were white, their hands gloved with a pale corpse-colored rubber. The light was frozen, dead, a ghost. Only from the yellow barrels of the microscopes did they borrow the scent of a certain rich and living substance, lying along the polished tubes like butter, steak after a luxurious steak, in long recession, down at the work tables. And this, said the director, opening the door, is the fertilization room. The container was lifted out of the liquor and its contents re-examined. How, if any of the eggs remained unfertilized, it was again immersed, and, if necessary, yet again, how the fertile ova went back to the incubator, where alphas and betas remained until definitely bottled, while gammas and deltas, espelons, were brought out again only after 36 hours to undergo Bonknovsky's process. Bonknovsky's process, repeated the director, and the students underlined the words in their little notebook. 1 egg, 1 embryo, 1 adult. Normality. But a Boroskenov's egg will bud, will proliferate, will divide from 8 to 96 buds, and every bud will grow into a perfectly formed embryo, and every embryo into a full-sized adult, making 96 human beings grow where only one grew before. Process. Essentially, the DHC concluded, Bonknovskification consists of a series of arrests of developments. We check the normal growth, and paradoxically enough, the eggs respond by budding. The pencils were busy. He pointed on a very slowly moving band. A rack full of test tubes was entering a large metal box. Another rack full of emerging machinery faintly purred. It only took 8 minutes for the tubes to go through. He told them 8 minutes of hard X-ray, being about as much as an egg can stand. A few died of the rest. The least susceptible divided into 2. Most put out 4 buds, some 8. All were returned to incubators, where the buds began to develop. Then, after 2 days, were suddenly chilled and checked. 2, 4, 8. The buds, in turn, budded. Having budded, were close to almost death with alcohol. Consequently, burgeoned again, and having budded, bud out of the bud out of the bud. Were thereafter further arrests being greatly fatal, left to develop in peace, by which time the original egg was was in a far way to becoming anything from 8 to 96 embryos. Prodigious improvement, will you agree? Only on nature. Identical twins, but not impiddling 2s and 3s, as in the old viviparous days, when an egg would sometimes accidentally divide, actually by dozens, by scores at a time. Scores, the director repeated, and flung out his arms, as though he was distributing large gifts. Scores. But only one. But one of the students was fool enough to ask where the advantage lay. My good boy, the director wheeled sharply on him. Can't you see? Can't you see? He raised a hand. His expression was solemn. Bolnowski's process is one of the major instruments of social stability. Major instruments of social stability. Standard men and women, in uniform batches, the whole of a small factory, staffed with the products of a single Bosniak egg. 96 identical twins, working 96 identical machines. The voice was almost tumultuous with enthusiasm. You can really know where you are. For the first time in history, he quoted the Planetary motto, community, identity, stability. Grand words. If we could Bernoxify indefinitely, the whole problem would be solved. Solved by standard gammas, varying deltas, uniform espionage, millions of identical twins. The principle of mass production at last applied to biology. But alas, the director shook his head. We can't Brosnify indefinitely. 96 seems to be the limit. 72 a good average from the same ovaries with the same gametes, with the same male to manufacture as many batches of identical twins as possible. That was the best, sadly a second best, that they could do. And even that was difficult. For in nature, it takes 30 years for 200 eggs to reach maturity. But our business is to stabilize the population at this moment, here and now, dribbling out twins over a quarter of a century. What would be the use of that? Obviously, no use at all. But Podsnap's technique had immensely accelerated the process of ripening. They could make sure of at least 150 mature eggs within 2 years. Fertilize and brostify. In other words, multiply by 72, and you get an average of nearly 11,000 brothers and sisters in 150 batches of identical twins, all within 2 years of the same age. And in exceptional cases, we can make one ovary yield us over 15,000 adult individuals. Beckoning to a fair-haired, ruddy young man who happened to be passing at the moment. Mr. Foster, he called, and a ruddy young man approached. Can you tell us the record for a single ovary, Mr. Foster? 16,012 in the center. Mr. Foster replied without hesitation. He spoke very quickly, in a vicious blue eye, and took an evident pleasure in quoting figures. 16,012. 189 batches of identicals. But of course, they have done much better. He read on, in some tropical centers, Singapore has often produced over 16,500, and Mabasa actually has touched the 17,000 mark. But then they have an unfair advantages. You should see the way, I am not going to say that word, responds to perpetuary. It's quite astonishing when you're used to working with Ethiopian material. Still, he added, with a laugh, but a light combat was in his eyes, and the lift of his chin was a challenge. Still, we mean to beat them if we can. I'm working on a wonderful Delta Minus over at this moment. Only just 18 months old, over 12,700 children already, either decanted or an embryo. And still are going strong. We'll beat them yet. That's the spirit I like, cried the director and clapped Mr. Foster on the shoulder. Come along with us. Give us these boys the benefit of your expert knowledge. Mr. Foster smiled modestly. With pleasure, they went into the bottling room. All was harmonious bustle and ordered activity. Flaps of flesh shone petroleum, ready to cut to the proper size, came shooting up in a little lips from the organ store in sub-basement. Whiz, then click. Then the lift hatches flew open. The bottle liner only reached out the hand. Take the flap, insert, smooth down, and before the lined bottle had time to travel out and reach along the endless band, whiz, click, another flap of petroleum, and shot up from the depths, ready to be slipped into yet another bottle. And next, the slow, intermediable process on the band. Next, the liners stood, the matrix calculators, the procession advanced. One by one, the eggs were transferred from the test tubes into large containers. Definitely, the petroleum lining was slit. The morula dropped into place. The saline solution poured in, and already the bottle had passed. And it was the turn of the labelers. Parity, date of fertilization, membership of the Brunowski group. Details were transferred from the test tube to bottle, no longer anonymous, but named, identified, and precision marched slowly on. And on through an opening of the wall, slowly on into the social predestination room. 88 cubic meters of card index, said Mr. Foster with a relish as they entered, containing all the relevant information, added the director. Brought up to date every morning, and co-ordered every afternoon, on the basis of which they make their calculations. So many individuals, such and such quality, Mr. Foster, distributed in such and such quantities, and opium decanting rate at any given moment. Unforeseen wastage promptly made good. Promptly, repeated Mr. Foster. If you knew the amount of overtime I had to put in after the last Japanese earthquake, he laughed good-humoredly and shook his head. The presidenters sent in their figures with fertilizers, who give them the embryos they ask for, and the bottles came in here to be predestined in detail, after which they sent down the embryo store, where we now proceed ourselves. And opening the door, Mr. Foster led the way down the staircase into the basement. The temperature was still tropical. They descended into a thickening twilight, 2 doors in a passage with a double turned in cellar against any possible infiltration from the day. Embryos are like photographic film, said Mr. Foster waggishly. As he pushed open the second door, they can only stand a red light. In the effect, the slush-buckets into which students now followed him was visible and crimson, like the darkness of closed eyes on a summer afternoon. The bludgeoning flasks of row on receding row, and tier above tier of bottles glinted with innumerable rubies. Among the rubies moved the dim red spectres of men and women with purple eyes and symptoms of lupus. And Huns and Rattle's machinery faintly stirred in air. Give him a few figures, Mr. Foster, the director, who tried talking. Mr. Foster only too happy to give them a few figures. 220 meters long, 220 meters wide, 10 high. He pointed upwards like chickens drinking, and students lifted their eyes towards the distant ceilings. 3 tiers of racks ground